But let's go and talk about Joel Embiid now.
Okay.
Joel Embiid has been diagnosed with what is being described by Shams Charania and Joe Varden as a displaced flap of the meniscus in his left knee and is considering surgery. Two sources briefed on his prognosis told The Athletic. A displaced flap is considered to be a type of tear of the meniscus, according to orthopedic knee specialists. Embiid, his doctors, and the 76ers are continuing to discuss whether the course of action is to rest and rehab the injury or to undergo a procedure that would require him to miss extended time. Look, this seems bad to me. Part of this is like the 76ers are not very good at describing injuries and explaining injuries. This goes all the way back to the Sam Hinkie era, probably before that even. So we're not getting a lot of information there. Now we're getting information from sourcing and reporting, and all of this seems quite complicated. Brian Sutterer, who is an injury doctor on Twitter, said, straight up, a displaced flap is a tear, not an injury. The meniscus is torn. Two, if you tell a sports doc someone has a quote unquote displaced flap, those words are often used to describe something that needs surgery. Three, if rest/rehab is still an option, then they really aren't communicating this in a good way. All of that is to be said. This does not seem, to me at least, like a short-term injury, or at the very least, something that will allow Joel Embiid to get back to 100% health sooner rather than later, right? Like, even if he returns and like tries to play through it, it feels very much like this is not a deal where, he's going to be at 100% for the rest of the season, right? So I'll ask you, where do we feel like this leaves the 76ers? Where do we feel like this leaves everything as we try and figure out what happens with them?
Yeah, so I don't like to get into medical stuff because obviously that's not what I do. I do have experience with knee injuries. I've tore my ACL 3 times in college. Usually with ACL injuries, you tear meniscuses. Like one of them specifically, like I know exactly what this feels like. This doesn't sound like a rest injury, right? Whenever there's a flap, whatever the wording is, it sounds like either you have to go in and shave it or stitch it or whatever. And then the time frame on those is different depending on what you choose to do based on that type of stuff. But either way, I've never talked like, it doesn't sound like that's a rest type of thing. So anyway, I've just kind of been working under the assumption we do not see Joel Embiid again this season. That's where I'm at.
Maybe that's speculative, to be clear.
Yes.
And I'm not far off of that either. Like, I think it's going to be some time until we see Joel, and how the 76ers survive maybe might play a role in how he ends up returning. But I'm with you that I think this seems, based on the reporting, not from any sort of,
Correct.
reporting that I've done personally or you've done personally. We're speculating based on all of the wording that's coming out. This seems like a longer term thing to me.
Because my thing is, even if it's rest, you're talking a couple weeks, 3 weeks. I mean, it seems significant enough that you'd have to rest for a while. If it's the shorter term surgery, you're looking at 4 weeks to 6 weeks. And I guess my thought process there is then, like you just alluded to, where are the Sixers at, Sam? That do you want to rush Joel Embiid back from a meniscus injury? I believe that's
the big thing.
The second one in this knee, specifically this knee. There's been injuries to other parts of the body, the other leg, those type of things. Do you bring him back in a situation where now you're 6th in the East, or you're in the play-in? Are you bringing Joel Embiid back to do that? And so that's where I've just kind of been, okay, if I put myself in the shoes of the Sixers front office, I would just kind of move forward, because we have 4 days to figure this out, right? Like, that's the other thing. We don't know how quick he's going to be back. So I'm just thinking, how would I operate the trade deadline for the Philadelphia 76ers with what we know right now? And I do think it would change my calculation a little bit in terms of what I was going after. And I think that's where we're ready to dive into, is how does this change things up for the Sixers over the next 4 days?
So I think it like unequivocally it changes your thought process, but I don't know if it actually changes the end conclusions. Because the whole thing for the Philadelphia 76ers this year has been trying to maintain their long-term assets so that they can go out in the summer and potentially make a bigger splash to go get a star that is currently not available on the trade market. Like the trade market right now seems quite quiet in terms of going to get like your third star next to Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid. To do that, the 76ers need to really only go after expirings or guys that have like real flexibility, such as like a Bojan Bogdanovic, somebody like that, who has a contract that is like very minimally guaranteed next season, doesn't really affect their flexibility long term. So when I look at this, it feels like things for me don't change much, right? Like it's
So,
not like
but would you
things like
still
are
would you trade for Boyan or DeRozan? Because those guys made sense, right? They weren't the third star necessarily,
yeah.
but they were on contracts where then you could like Boyan, you could either let go. I mean, not like that's not the right terminology, but take the 2 million or you can exercise it, keep it fully guarantee it, and use it as a trade asset.
Yeah.
My thing is like, I don't think you do that now. Like you either go for a third star right now, which it doesn't sound like is there, or the other option is like, do they consider trading off these expirings now for assets? Like, do you need Marcus Morris on the roster? Do you need Nick Batum on the roster? Do you need those guys? Because you weren't going to do that with Embiid in a playoff run over the next few months. So I don't think I think that's where it changes a little bit for me, or I wonder if it would change for them.
So I guess what I would say there is like I've always thought that those kinds of deals were very unlikely
Okay.
for the 76ers. I don't think they were going to give up what the Chicago Bulls seemingly want for DeMar DeRozan in a like significant deal,
Got you.
right?
Okay.
Like I don't think they were going to give up like a first round pick and a pick swap or something like that for DeMar DeRozan.
Got
I
you.
think that they would have hoarded those assets in order to hope for a bigger name or a bigger star in order to come available eventually, right?
Got Yep.
The deals that always made more sense to me for them were something along the lines of a Bojan Bogdanovic, a Gordon Hayward, I guess you could say like a Malcolm Brogdon, because Malcolm you could say is like a bigger expiring contract next season in the off season. So you could just like use him to salary match like in a bigger trade if somebody decides that they want that. But even then, those are even somewhat difficult to do. Like I've never thought like D'Angelo Russell like made a lot of sense for them. I've always just kind of thought this was likely to be a quieter deadline for them. And I know that like 76ers fans are not super enthusiastic to hear that. Uh, I just always kind of thought that it was always going to be like we're going and getting things on the margins more than anything, as opposed to going and getting things that like are star level difference makers. Like the DeJounte Murray thing, like never lined up for me. Like I said, Zach LaVine never lined up for me. DeRozan never lined up for me. Pascal Siakam like never really lined up for me. OG Anunoby I think made a lot of sense for them, but they were going to have to make a decision on like, do we want to pay him and do we think he's good enough to be a third star? And I don't know if that's the case, frankly. So I wonder on the other side now, do the 76ers kind of similarly to what you're saying, Marcus Morris, Robert Covington, guys like that, they have a lot of expiring deals. Is there a chance that if they feel like Joel is just straight up not coming back this year and they're like not bringing back Tobias Harris, like they feel like Tobias Harris is not coming back, do they maybe like try and sell Tobias Harris to somebody? Do they try and like get like, do you try and do like an expiring kind of deal with, I don't know, like Detroit or somebody for Tobias Harris, right? Maybe you do Tobias for Joe Harris, James Wiseman, and like a pick or something like that. Maybe Detroit is interested in Tobias Harris and Tobias Harris, in the offseason, and this would allow you to get his bird rights, and you can then pay him what is necessary to keep him. I don't know. Like, I wonder if that opens up that kind of world a little bit more, if they think Joel is just like not going to be there, where you can get even more assets
Yes.
to use in a trade this offseason to go get your star that you seem very set on trying to go get to work with Joel and Tyrese.
Yeah, and that's the thing, like, I don't know how many, like, I don't think you're getting first round picks or anything like that, but like Detroit has a very quality second round pick. It's not their own, but it's the worst of like the Wizards and the Grizzlies or something like that. It's going to be a high second round pick. And I'm not saying I would do this for Detroit, but that's what I wonder if they do. You go get an extra second round pick, and then maybe it makes it easier to trade some other first round picks for the third star that you're talking about, whoever that ends up being. And then also, I'm not saying you punt on the season, but do you get Terquavion Smith some minutes? You get Ricky Council some minutes. You get Jaden Springer some minutes. Some of those guys some time on the floor to find out, okay, can these guys help us once we get past this season, or can they not? Just find out what you have. I don't want them to completely punt on the season, but it's like, I feel like depending on what their intel is on Joel and his potential return or not, I wonder if that's a path. That's just such a quick transition in essentially 7 days, though. Like, that's a hard mentality shift to make those.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's super, super quick. The other thing I will say is, if I was them, and I'm sure they're doing this, I would still be on the phone searching, like, in case that third star does come available, the name that we don't know that maybe ends up being on the market, they can still make that move right now. Like, you could bring him in, play that person with Tyrese Maxey the rest of the year, and have him in place for the start of the offseason into next season. I don't see that because I don't like any of the names necessarily either, but I don't think this puts him out of making that move now as opposed to the offseason if the right name and the right price becomes available.
Yeah. So, like, what if you did something like this to Philly, where it was, and I'm pulling this up as we talk about it. I'm trying to pull this up functionally as we talk about it. Can you see this? Yes. So you do something like Joe Harris, James Wiseman, Marcus Sasser, and that early second round pick for Tobias Harris.
I mean,
if the Pistons, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I would do that if I'm the 76ers, assuming and I say that so quickly because I think Marcus Sasser is good at basketball. So
no, I think he's pretty good too. I just think that they're not gonna, like, I don't think the Sixers will just like give up Tobias Harris for nothing, because he's valuable for them this season, right? But if you're saying, okay, we have a really young point guard here in Marcus Sasser, we could potentially add him to like another deal down the road at some point for a star. If we think that another team thinks he's good, we can get this early second round pick, something like that. And then you get the expirings. It doesn't really impact your cap space this summer. It just adds 2.6 million. The Pistons, if they want to get a real four-man in the mix, which based on the reporting, it seems like that's something. I wonder if something like this makes sense if the 76ers know more about Joel Embiid's injury than what has been presented. If they think he's going to be back, like if they think he can get back to 100% by the playoffs, then you absolutely keep Tobias Harris. Like there's no question here, right? Like you don't mess around with that. If you think Joel is back by the playoffs, you make a playoff run and you go for it. But if you feel like that Joel is not going to be above 9, or is not going to be at like 90% or higher in the playoffs, do you look to do something like that? Because Tobias, genuinely, like, for as much shit as Tobias Harris gets, Tobias Harris right now is shooting something like 51, 35, 88 or something, while averaging 17 points per game. He's like a tremendous, like, impactful third scorer who can play off the ball and like be able to do stuff. I don't know. Like, I feel like that's an interesting one. The other piece of it is like, yeah, that's a terrible deal for Detroit, because if Tobias wants to be there, he can just sign there rather than giving up Sasser. Yeah, that's right. But there is the real factor of getting his bird rights, which is valuable. Although they have like crazy cap space,
Yeah.
so I guess they don't really need to do that. Uh, yeah, I mean, it's more about keeping Tobias long term above all, and like trying to get more bodies in for the end of this season in order to help with the floor spacing, help Cade and Jaden be impactful in some way, help them get good reps, which they just haven't gotten this season.
They need the
I don't
Pistons
know,
need a
like,
four. The Pistons need a real four man. Like I go back and forth on whether I
yeah,
think that should be Tobias Harris at 31 years old and all of that stuff. And I don't know what the money would be for the next contract, everything like that. We've seen it play out over the last couple of weeks with Mike Muscala playing at the four. That when they have a four man or then even a five man at times that can space the floor, that team looks more functional offensively. It looks better. It looks more realistic. I still like Isaiah Stewart. He's a third big that should be playing 60 to 70% of his minutes at the five. I've said that for a couple years now. So again, I'm not sold that it's Tobias, but they do need somebody like that.
yeah. And look, like, I'm not sitting here saying that I think this is a good idea for Detroit. I don't. I'm just basing this off of reporting that they really want a four man, and Tobias, if they know that he is not going to go back to Philly, and if they know Joel is not going to be back in some way, shape, or form this season, do you look to move Tobias Harris in a move like that where you're giving up a first, you're giving up an early second, basically, you're giving up a late first, you're giving up an early second. You have all of your awesome young players in place. You want to try and surround them with some competence. I'm not saying it's a move I'd make. I'm saying I can see it being a move that a certain type of general manager would make.
If you took
Um,
Sasser out of the deal, I'd be a lot more inclined to consider that just because, I mean, you can only have so much young talent on the roster they can develop anyway, as valuable as that early second round pick. I would consider a little bit more. I think ideally, like we just got the framework of what we're talking about, though. If Philly was in this situation 4 days from now, couldn't you go get something like some sort of asset for Tobias Harris? And there are some teams out there
yeah.
that could use, like you just rattled off, a guy, in Tobias Harris that can come in and fill a role for your team.
Yeah. And like the other piece of this is like, are we sure? Like, what if Tobias Harris was willing to like do an extension?
Yeah.
Right. Like that's his number is big enough to where he could do an extension on basically anything. Like I don't know. I wonder if that's an interesting potential outcome at the end of the day. But look, that would require Joel to be hurt. And we're just kind of trying to figure out where all this could go for the Philadelphia 76ers. And frankly, I don't know because they're being circumspect about the Joel injury. We don't know a lot of detail about it. We're still all trying to figure out, we're all trying to find the guy who did this, right? Like that's where we're at here.
And
Anything else on the Sixers? I mean, as we try and figure this out, where do we think that without Joel for, let's say, 25 more games, something like that, 20 more games, maybe he comes back in, a month and a half or something. Where do we think that leaves them in the Eastern Conference?
so that's where I was about to go as well, because as I sit here and say, who knows where they are if he misses 4 to 6 weeks. So they're at fifth right now at time of recording, but they're still four up on Orlando and Indiana at 6 and 7. They're 4.5 up on Miami and then like 8 up on the 9 seed. I mean, if he missed 25 games, though, there's a chance that team falls into the play-in. And again, it's like, okay,
Ooh,
what's that?
man, falls into the play-in. Jesus.
You don't think so? Without Joel Embiid?
So they are currently,
They're 5 games ahead. No, they're 4 games ahead of Orlando and Indiana.
yeah, in Miami is the 7 right now, and they're 4.5 ahead of them. I guess it's possible.
I didn't say it
I'll
was
be honest.
likely.
I hadn't really thought about them falling into the play-in.
You said 25 games. That's a lot of
Yeah.
games. I mean, is it so what if they went Are they going to do much better than 500 over a 25 game span without Joel Embiid?
So without Joel on the court this season, they are a plus 1.7 team per 100 possessions. Good portion of those minutes as well, like have recently been in the games where like Tyrese Maxey's missed a couple here, Tobias Harris has missed a couple here. Like, they lost by 15 to Brooklyn with 4 starters out, right? Like, it's kind of like a Nets situation last year, right? Like the Nets got rid of Kyrie and KD, and they still like basically survived. I wonder if, like, let's say Philly is a 500 team the rest of the way over those 25 games. Let's say that they're a 13-12 team. That still gets them to
It's close.
43 and 30 with
So then
9 or
it's
10 games left in the season.
so I
I
guess
mean,
that's
in
the
that
aspect,
case,
right?
like, yeah, the Heat would have to go on or the Magic, let's call it the Heat or the Magic, would have to go on like a 18-7 run. I don't know, man. That's
Okay. No, you're
like,
right.
I think they finished in the top 6. What you're saying is like not an impossibility. I think that they would survive enough to where they would stay in the top 6.
No, that's fair, because as you do the math and think about what those other teams would have to do to make that jump, that makes a little more sense. Like I'm just looking at their schedule. They have the Warriors, they have the Hawks, they have the Wizards. They go on a tough stretch: Heat, Knicks, Cavs, Bucks, Celtics. But then you still have some games against the Hornets, the Grizzlies. So I think what it comes down to is, do they win all of those games?
Yeah.
Like, do they win the games against the teams you have to beat to at least be 500? I guess I was thinking if they go 500, they're only 4 games up. Those other teams are probably going to pass them. Two of those other two teams would have to get on a hot streak, both of them. Still, then you're in the 7th seed and you have 10 games of Joel back before to try to maybe get into the top 6. So I don't know.
So we're kind of operating under the idea that the 76ers know something, right? That they have a feel for this. They have a better feel for this than what we do. They certainly have a better feel for this than what we do. That's not an exaggeration or a lie. But let's say they are operating with imperfect information, because it could be anywhere from 10 games to 20 games to the rest of the season, right? Like if no decisions have been made yet, they don't know what that will look like at the end of the day. So let's say that they're working with imperfect information. If you are working with imperfect information and you feel like there is a chance that Joel can go in the playoffs, what would you do at the deadline?
I would then still I would make those moves that we talked about that I was saying I wouldn't make if he was out for the season. So, I mean, I think you're still always looking for the third star, no matter what. I think whether he's hurt or not, or misses 1 game or the rest of the season, whatever, I think and we don't think that person's out there. So we'll shove that aside. I wouldn't do the Tobias Harris deal that we talked about, I know that wasn't the exact deal, but I would look to make a move on the margins. Boyan, whoever that is, that player that's going to come in and help you win games. And then also, if it's 20 games, 25, maybe you call up one of these teams that has an extra center and see if you can get some minutes from, like, I don't know, whoever's on the market at center that can come in and play those minutes. And then, I guess they don't need a backup with Paul Reed, but I would find somebody to, play those minutes until Joel gets him back. So I would make those 2 moves. Whatever move you were going to make to help booster things now while keeping the long-term flexibility, and then find somebody to eat up those center minutes for 10, 15, 20 games, whatever it's going to be. I would still go for it then, I guess, is my point.
Yeah, if that's the case and they're working with imperfect information, I would try and buy on the margins and make it so that I still have immense flexibility in the summer and keep my cap sheet clear. Gordon Hayward is the name that makes a ton of sense to me. Could you do something like Gordon Hayward for Marcus Morris, Robert Covington, and 3 second-round picks?
So then, like,
something along those lines.
what would you have to add to that to get Nick Richards in the deal also?
I don't know if I would want Nick Richards because he signed for $5 million next year.
You don't think you could just get rid of that if you needed to, or
Yeah, you could.
like the reason I say Nick Richards, I know the flexibility, but the number's so small. I just feel like it wouldn't be that hampering, especially if you felt like he could help. I'm not saying Nick Richards is like, can he help you win a couple games? Can he eat up those minutes while Joel isn't out?
He can, and he would be useful for them. Honestly, I think Paul Reed is better than he is.
Sure.
I think he probably costs like a good second round pick and like another second round pick. And I don't know that they have enough like asset capital really
Sure.
to do that. Like if they would be willing to throw in Nick Richards, if I threw in, Jaden Springer or something like that, I would probably do that. But otherwise, I'm just going to check this to see if the math works. I don't even know if it does, to be honest with you. It does. I don't know if I would. Yeah, I don't know if I would do that. Yeah, like I don't see. Grape Ape brings up like teams want Nick Richards. He isn't a throw in. Like he's not a throw in.
No,
That's right.
no, and
And I don't think Jaden Springer's all that good, frankly. So like to me, it's if I'm doing this, I'm doing it like Gordon Hayward probably, and hoping I can get Gordon Hayward for 3 second round picks.
to be clear, I did ask, I said, what else would it take to get Nick Richards, guys? So I know that I didn't
Yeah,
say just throw in Nick Richards to the trade. I was just asking,
100%.
how could I also get Nick Richards? Like if we're doing a deal with Charlotte to get Gordon Hayward, which I love that idea. I think Gordon Hayward's a really quality player to add to a team that's trying to compete. I was just saying, what else would it take to then get Nick Richards in that deal? Because I knew it was for $5 million. Because as you countered right away, you either have to get somebody on very, very small money or somebody that's on an expiring deal if you're going to go down the road that I'm talking about in terms of getting a center to come play for 15, 20. Maybe they can just make it work without one, right? Like you start Paul Reed and play Mo Bamba off the bench and play
Yeah.
Tobias and some of those guys at the 5 and just go small for minutes, and you just figure it out till Joel gets back.
Yeah, and like the problem even with like a name like Bruce Brown is that Bruce Brown, I think, is going to get a first round pick. Like I think some team will give up a late first round pick for Bruce Brown. So you probably get outbid in that scenario if you're the Philadelphia 76ers. So even a name like that where you have his optional contract situation, that probably doesn't work. Bojan Bogdanovic, that probably doesn't work, I don't think. To me, I want to keep all my options open for the summer and making sure I have cap space, either for free agency or a trade. Let's say something crazy happens with the Clippers and Paul George comes available. Let's say something crazy happens with the Celtics, Drew Holiday comes available. You just never know what's going to happen in the summer for free agency. And then you also never know what's going to be available and what teams will want to do when they're put into a position where they have to trade a star. And once everything happens with the deadline and once everything happens with the playoffs, there's just going to be more options, I think, kind of out there. So yeah, we're going to have to kind of wait and see what happens there.
Yeah, it will be interesting. Somebody said it earlier, like, are we going to find out? I'm interested, Monday, do we get a report of some sort of timetable or what the plan of action is? Or, I listened to podcasts all weekend of, they're going to take the weekend to find out, what's wrong with this, what's the course of action, what's the rehab, is it surgery, all of those things. And so I'm interested what day that news drops. And then all of a sudden they're a very interesting team. Because again, based on that news and what the plan of action is and all of that could really dictate, not crazy. I think we've kind of walked ourselves into that, right? Like it's not going to drastically change, but it could be a subtle shift in what they end up doing at the deadline.
I think that's right. Okay, let's take a quick commercial break. Then we will be back and we're going to talk about Chicago because I find that whole thing